Hi everybody, Niall Paterson here in the Sky News Daily Podcast studio, joined by our sports correspondent, Rob Harris. Rob, good to see you.
Good to see you too. I feel like we should have some Premier League highlights to watch here.
Premier League highlights. Now, why are you mentioning that? The reason you are in the studio is, of course, Match of the Day and Gary Lineker. And, of course, at this point, do you know what I'd like more than anything to do, Rob, is play the Match of the Day theme tune. You know it well, I presume.
But are we going to have to improvise?
Well, we can't play it. We're not allowed to play it. It will cost us far too much. It will certainly be coming out of my salary rather than yours. But if we just maybe hint towards it, people can have it playing in their minds as we begin our discussion on the podcast. Look, obviously, the story of the day when it comes to Gary Lineker and Match of the Day is he will no longer be presenting the show come the end of the season. And he's been doing it for what, quarter of a century?
Yeah, since 1999. There was a brief period when his predecessor, Des Lynam, defected to ITV and presented their own rival version at the start of the century, but the BBC regained the highlights. Remember, it was front page news at the time, Snatch of the Day, when ITV took the rights, and that shows how much of an institution Match of the Day is. Well, some might see it as some outdated footballing institution. Still has a relevance, but how much going forward, and without Lineker?
And it certainly still has plenty of viewers, but as you say, Gary Lineker, great domestic servant for England, great club professional footballer, fantastic broadcaster. I think we would both concede that. But he did come with some issues, and in particular, his salary.
Yeah, the highest earner at the BBC. He took a 23% pay cut when he did his last deal in 2020, but still at £1.35 million, well exceeding anyone else on that list. And that put an increasing spotlight on him, particularly as he had his critics in the Conservative government at the time, as he was so strident with his opinions on social media.
It wasn't just, the Tories that I had a pop at. I mean, Gary Lineker became quite outspoken, I would say, on the big issues that everyone is dealing with: elections, wars, and, of course, politics.
Yeah, he is criticised perhaps being one-sided. It does run into conflict with those at the BBC who have to maintain impartiality. And, of course, it brings us to when he was forced off one episode, memorably, of Match of the Day last year, when his views on the small boats crisis became too opinionated for the BBC, and his colleagues came out in solidarity and also wouldn't go on air on Match of the Day that weekend.
You mentioned the small boats there. He compared the kind of then government's policy to Germany in the 1930s. Plenty of people thought that was going slightly too far. So you have this kind of conflation of an incredibly important figure, an incredibly influential figure, an incredibly well-off figure, and an incredibly outspoken BBC presenter. And do we think then, as a result, he was pushed?
There is that sense of this friction was becoming increasingly problematic for the BBC. We often think of footballers and ex-footballers as being too bland and not expressing their opinions and showing no wider world view or sense of awareness. So certainly Gary has had that over the years, but then it is the type of post that you choose to share that might only present very much a one-sided, narrow version of a story, which can actually alienate part of his audience as well. And set against this, a new boss comes in of BBC Sport over the summer who has to confront this.
Tell us about the boss, because, of course, linear television, about which an awful lot more later on in the podcast, isn't exactly in great health right now. The new head of BBC Sport would always want to kind of shake things up a little bit, but it does come with, a pedigree himself, doesn't he?
Yeah, and obviously, being sports correspondent myself, you do encounter these people over the years as well. Alex Kajelski, the new director of BBC Sport, previously at The Times, the Mail Group as well as the Athletic Sports subscription site. And he's been brought in to take the BBC into a new era in sport, and that's not just about television, it's about the online proposition as well. We've seen as well how Gary Lineker has shown how podcasting can be highly lucrative because he's grown his goal hanger operation over the years, often giving some of his more strident opinions off BBC platforms, but on his own, the rest is football. But it shows Gary Lineker's mindset, and it began as a player, really. He started to think about his post-playing career and wanting broadcasting, and not just happy being the presenter, but also a business operator as well.
Let's just kind of step back from Gary Lineker and focus again on Match of the Day. I mean, this is a highlights programme in an age where I can pick up my phone and I can get a 20-second clip of the goal that I want to see in 20 seconds. I mean, is there still a place for Match of the Day in the BBC roster.
It's interesting because Match of the Day has expanded this season. They now have, for the first time, Men's Champions League rights. So they're showing highlights every Wednesday from all the matches. And, we've seen actually how they've adjusted the format on there. They've even brought a journalist onto the panel to perhaps give that more of a broader perspective on European football. But who perhaps might have imagined in this fragmented broadcasting environment, there still would be this audience to watch matches from hours earlier. Yes, particularly on a Saturday, 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon Premier League matches are still not able to be shown live in this country. So no one watching on television can legitimately watch those. But the highlights now do go out fairly quickly, 5:15 on a Saturday, without sounding too much of an internal plug, from Sky Sports on the Premier League YouTube channel that they run. So you can watch all those highlights.
But look, but when you have less than half of under 25s watching what we call linear television that you sit down, you switch on, you tune to your channel, and what is on is what you get to watch. When that statistic is true, you've got to wonder about the longevity of even something as totemic as Match of the Day going forward.
People do feel very associated with the sporting institutions on TV. Perhaps Match of the Day has evolved, and that's how it's maintained its relevance. It has become a lot more analytical and forensic as it has evolved the panel over the years. It hasn't adjusted the format too much, although it does look very different from the era of Des Lynam in terms of the presentation, no longer being suit and tie. And it's those tweaks. So that is the big challenge, not to adjust it too much that alienates an audience, because we've seen when other programs like Wimbledon tennis highlights have brought in an audience and there's a backlash. People don't seem to like abrupt change in terms of how we are used to our shows.
But you haven't quite reached my level of advanced years, Rob. But at the same time, you are old enough to remember the days when you'd be sitting, in the front room on a Saturday night with your cheese and pickle toasty. That might be my personal memory. And the news would be on, and then they would say, if you don't want to know what the results were, look away now, so that Match of the Day you could watch it all in a wonner later on. Who on earth is doing that these days?
And how many can avoid the results?
Exactly.
As perhaps you used to during the day, you've got push notifications, so you've got to set your phone on Do Not Disturb or avoid all those notifications to miss out. Or perhaps people just want to soak up the football more. The fact is, people are listening to podcasts like Gary Lineker's. You know the results when you're listening to that on a Monday, but you want to hear the analysis. So perhaps that is what people are tuning in for still on Saturday night. It's the additional content, and you can overlook that insatiable demand to talk about football, to debate the decisions in matches. The fact all week is spent discussing them. Here at Sky, we have Sky Sports News going through all those fan debates and discussions over the VAR decisions and what's going wrong at the club. So it shows that people do want to still soak up the Premier League content. Perhaps it's less about Match of the Day's ongoing relevance, but how other sports struggle to even have that sort of profile. ITV had Premiership Rugby highlights. They're no longer showing those. Cricket doesn't have the prominence it once had on terrestrial TV as well.
Welcome back to The Daily, where we're continuing to discuss the departure of Gary Lineker from Match of the Day, the ramifications of that decision, and indeed the future for the show at a time when viewing habits are certainly shifting significantly. We've let Rob Harris leave the studio. In his place, Stuart Rowson, founder of Lucky Sports Media, company that helps brands, clubs, sports events and more engage with younger audiences. Before setting up Lucky Socks, he worked for the BBC across their news, sport and kids programming departments. Stuart, great to have you with us. I mean, first things first, your reflections on the departure of Gary Lineker.
I think Gary Lineker is by far the best sports presenter in the country. And let's face it, for a while, Gary Lineker was average. His first season, he was pretty wooden, first into it, but now he's the absolute consummate presenter for me. And, whenever the BBC Sport and ITV go head to head, what Gary Lineker brings to a World Cup or everything else, he's just head and shoulders above anybody else that's around, really.
I do wonder if this is as much about looking again at the format as it is at looking at, one of the highest paid BBC stars?
I think the wage issue is a bit of a misnomer. Look, it's a big, brave decision to not extend Gary Lineker's contract, but not unsurprising, I think, because it lays down a marker for a new boss, frankly. But also it is a changing way that audiences now consume football and football highlights. Young adults do not watch. They don't wait to sit around and watch highlights at 10:30 on a Saturday night. They'll have watched them, as I do, by 5:30 on a Saturday or whatever the time the game is, or even in-game when you can watch the goals, or whether it's a legal or illegal stream through one of the social platforms really, really quickly. So it is a changing format and a changing moment for audiences. But don't forget, it's not all audiences. So, in the media, I think we often get obsessed by, oh my God, everybody's watching short form video. Not everybody is. Match of the Day still gets a really decent, healthy amount of what you might call traditional viewers. And as long as those viewers are still around, Match of the Day will still exist.
But those viewers are, like you, like me, getting older, aren't they? And you worked at the BBC. In fact, you were just telling me before we came on, you were the man responsible for getting rid of the Newsround tea time show.
Very similar situation. The Newsround tea time bulletin, I grew up with it, you grew up with it. It was an absolute staple of our childhoods. But times move on. And when we took the decision to take away the Newsround tea time bulletin from CBBC, it was at a moment in time when the audiences had fallen off a cliff. We'd moved it around a few times. It made no difference. And what we did is we changed the format. We extended the morning bulletins of Newsround that we knew that teachers and classrooms were using in their millions. And we put more money into the Newsround website. And that actually grew the audiences. But you can only make that decision a moment in time when you reach a tipping point. And I don't think that Match of the Day is at a tipping point yet. Certainly, it's a huge product and a huge programme still for the Beeb.
What has been, I was going to say fascinating, actually gobsmacking today, as I've been kind of reading around the viewing habits of the younger demographics when it comes to sport, is that first, they're not necessarily as interested in watching things live as our generation was, either going to the ground or watching it on the telly. And they're also not necessarily as interested in the analytics, that side of the coverage. It's the stories, it's the interpersonal relationships, it's their own relationships with the footballers, the staff, the presenters.
And I do a lot of work right across sport, doing some work with the RFU at the moment, different organisations. When it comes to a younger audience, I don't think it's with the live product. I think if you can get children and young people to a live game to experience it, the drama, the narrative, everything else still exists. The biggest issue is from the moment of final whistle to the moment of, kickoff, because that is an enormous amount of time where you need to develop habitual usage with a new audience. You need to do the storytelling that you've talked about there. That, it's not a surprise that we now see players appearing almost as platforms across their own social media channels or their own apps and things like that. So that is the real challenge. They've grown up with a mobile phone, and it's not a world of broadcasting anymore. We now live in a world of narrowcasting where I want my own experience, you want your own experience. And, Gen Z and Gen Alpha have grown up expecting to be part of that story. They want a voice, they want to share, they want to participate, they want to comment. And sometimes they want to do it directly with the athlete or with the footballer or with, the celebrity. And we see that a lot. And sometimes traditional media platforms kind of get in the way of that.
With your knowledge of the BBC, with your knowledge of young people and the way in which they consume media these days, I'm handing you the keys to the Match of the Day studio. What do you do with it?
You have to do almost exactly what they are doing at the moment. If you look on social media, you'll see that the Match of the Day brands have extended way into the likes of Instagram and Facebook with millions and millions of viewers. If you look right across some of those social media platforms, some of those most successful clips will still be from Match of the Day. So Match of the Day as a linear programme might have its audience absolutely dropping off, but it is picking up hundreds of thousands of new viewers and new eyeballs in different places. And that has to be the key to its longevity.
What, if anything, then, would you do with where it sits in the schedule and who, in fact, sits on the sofa, the main presenter and the panel.
I think there's been talk before about should they bring in Match of the Day to be a Saturday tea time proposition and things like that. I don't think it will be or can be. And if I'm honest, I wouldn't be surprised if the biggest change that we see from Match of the Day is probably new presenter, and that might be as far as it goes. My money would be on somebody like Alex Scott coming in as a presenter.
Yeah.
The audience that are watching Match of the Day at 10:30 on a Saturday night, or as I still watch it, on a Sunday morning on iPlayer, they're not tuning in to watch Gary. They're not tuning in to listen to Alan Shearer, as good as both of them might be. They're going there because they want to see the game highlights. Now, the fact that you then get great clips that you can use on social media is a nice bonus. But I don't think that the format will change massively up until the point that somebody has to make a decision for Match of the Day not to exist anymore.
And that certainly looks some way off for the time being, at least. Many thanks to Stuart and, of course, to Rob Harris. The Daily is back again, same time tomorrow. We'll see you then.